Willa of the Wood, Chapter 11. She struggled against him, but Willa knew she couldn't fight Gredick. She couldn't overpower him. She couldn't strike him with a blow to defeat him. He was far too strong. And with his brutish brother Sidurg and the nasty Kiernan and all the other jetters who followed him, he had far too many allies. As he pressed her up against the rock wall, the jagged edges of the stone jammed into her shoulder blades, driving a slash of pain into her wound. He pushed against her so hard that she could barely expand her chest enough to take a breath. But as the grip of Gredick's fingers slowly squeezed her throat shut, she pushed out a last few words. "Let me speak, Gredick," she wheezed. Gredick leaned his face close to hers and looked into her eyes. "I'm warning you, no tricks, Willa. Don't try to run." "I will not run," she said, her voice thin and raspy through the grip of his fingers. "Swear it," he demanded. "I swear that I will not run," she said. Finally, Gredick loosened his grip on her throat and stepped back away from her. "Now, tell me what happened to you last night. Where's your satchel?" At that moment, Willa blended herself into the color and texture of the lichen that clung to the rock. She wove herself so completely into the world around her that she disappeared. Her skin, her eyes, her hair, she vanished. Although they'd seen her do it before, the Farron boys gasped as much in anger as in surprise. Gredick immediately reached out to grab her again, but she had already dropped to the ground and curled into a little ball at the base of the rock. "Where'd she go?" Sidurg shouted, sweeping his stick back and forth through the open air where he'd seen her last. "She tricked us!" Kiernan shrieked. "Just find her!" Gredick screamed in frustration as he searched the ground around him. Willa had promised she wouldn't run, and she didn't. She crawled slowly and invisibly away from the Jetter boys. They searched frantically for her, flailing their arms around them and poking with their sticks. They stabbed into the ground and jabbed into the trees. They rustled bushes and kicked up dirt, but their efforts were useless. They couldn't find her. Finally, Gredick said, "Come on, she'll have to come back to the lair sooner or later, and we'll catch her then." "We'll catch her then," Kiernan repeated, dragging his hand across his nose as they headed off. "The Padaran's going to be burning that she didn't come home last night," Sidurg said, seeming to relish the thought. "There's no slinking away from that." "Maybe not," Gredick said, "but whatever we do, we need to get her satchel before she sees the Padaran. She must have something good to be doing all this." As the Jetter boys climbed up through the rocky gorge, following the path that led beneath the Watcher hanging between its stony walls, they finally disappeared into the distance, but she knew she hadn't seen the last of them. They'd be waiting, ready to filch her satchel and drag her empty-handed before the Padaran in shame. Her mama had told her that many of the Jetters had no parents or grandparents to raise them, and that they had lost their way. And just as with the humans, that which the Jetters did not understand, they destroyed. And that meant her. When she was certain the Jetters were well gone, she thought it was safe for her to come out of her hiding place. She climbed back up the giant tree and retrieved her satchel from the woodpecker's hole. She knew it was very dangerous to carry it, but she realized now more than ever that she was going to need it as soon as she returned to Dead Hollow. Just as she began to start her climb down, she heard voices below her. She gazed from her bird's eye view down into the gorge to see a band of the Padaran's guards winding along the path and going out into the forest. They were moving quickly and with purpose, carrying their spears as well as other equipment she couldn't make out. She'd never seen anything like it. The guards seemed to be in some sort of hunting party, but Farron didn't hunt the animals of the forest. She knew she couldn't take the main path into the lair, so when she finally climbed back down, she took one of the side routes, then split off on her own through the steep and rocky forest. She climbed up and over a thicket-strangled ridge, her arm and shoulder hurting all the way. The healing lake of the bears had stopped the bleeding and saved her life, but the jabbing sticks and probing fingers of the Jetter boys had reopened the wound. She could feel the sticky blood oozing down her back. Finally, she could see the lair of her people. From a distance, the part of the Dead Hollow lair that was visible on the surface of the earth looked like a vast hornet's nest, with the same rough gray-brown irregular shape, but instead of being made from the hornet's sticky paper, the walls of their lair were made of a mesh of thousands of interwoven sticks. The walls had once been green and alive and woven together and sustained in life by the wood witches of the Farron past. They had used the same powerful woodcraft her mama had taught her, the same language she used to ask the trees to help her cross the river or intertwine around her when she needed to disappear. But the lair's walls were long dead now. Dead for more than 100 years, her mama said. The sticks twisted and rotting, blackened by their age, their roots decayed, for the woodcraft needed to keep the walls alive had long faded from the ways of the Farron. They just weren't enough wood witches to keep their lair green and alive anymore. The very name Wood Witch had become a title of scorn, even fear, to many in the clan, and the Padaran had forbidden the old ways. Willa climbed down into the gorge on the backside of the lair where few Farron ever crept. She found the spot that her mama had told her about, where 3 large rocks had crashed down from the wall of the ravine and left a small triangular hole that looked like nothing more than a crack in the stone. Getting down onto her hands and knees, she crawled inside. The crack became so tight that she had to get down onto her shoulder and wiggle her way like a centipede. When she finally reached the other side, she crawled out of the stone crack and found herself hunched in a small room, enclosed with walls of twisting, wet, rotting sticks. She wrinkled her mouth in revulsion as she drank as the dank stench of decaying branches that filled the air. Putrid sludge dripped from the ceiling. The area of the lair had been abandoned for decades and had been strictly forbidden by the Padaran, too dangerous for members of the clan to enter. Anxious to get out of this wretched part of the lair, she followed a narrow tunnel. It turned and then turned again until she came to a split that led off into several different directions. She picked the one that led upward and kept moving. She had to get home to her mama. The inside of the dead hollow lair consisted of a maze of woven stick tunnels, black and sticky from years of use, that wound through the gullet of the gorge into the small darkened rooms and secluded caves of her people. It had once been home to many thousands of Farron, but now only a few hundred remained, and there were many dark and empty places like this one left behind. Old storage areas and dens where Farron once lived, filled with nothing but the echoes of those who had come before. The tunnels of the lair connected one to the other like wormholes, twisting and writhing through the earth. As Willa tried to navigate her way back home, the wound on her shoulder began to throb. A wave of dizziness passed through her, and she nearly toppled to the floor. She clutched the wall to catch her balance and rest. When she touched her hand to the wound on her back, her fingers came back bright and slippery with fresh blood. Thanks to the healing lake of the bears, she felt a dull ache rather than a sharp pain, but her wound was bleeding again. If she couldn't find her way through these old tunnels, she was going to die here, and no one would ever know. She had to continue on. She came to a place where the tunnels split into 3 different directions, and she wasn't sure which way to go. She sniffed the air of each tunnel. In the tunnel on the left, she thought she could smell the distant scents of her clan. She hoped it led upward toward the more active parts of the lair, but then she heard a disturbing whimpering sound coming from the tunnel that led down to the right. She stopped and stayed quiet as she tried to identify the sound. It wasn't the wind howling wraith-like through the empty tunnels like it sometimes did. It sounded more like a wounded animal. Then she heard the sound again. Fear seeped into her body. She wiped her dry lips with the back of her hand. There was something down that tunnel. She could smell it. She wanted to go in the opposite direction. She wanted to get home. She had to get home. But the sound, it wasn't a whimpering animal. She heard it again. It was a voice. She took a few uncertain steps into the tunnel and cupped her hands around her ears to focus on the sound. She heard something dragging across the woven stick floor. Then she heard something breathing. Her chest began to rise and fall more heavily, pulling air into her lungs. She tilted her head and sniffed. The smell was oddly familiar, but it did not belong here. Not here. Her palms began to sweat. It was the smell of a human. How is that possible? She thought in confusion. That can't be. She took a few more steps down into the tunnel toward the noise she had heard. There were woven stick doors on each side with thorny vines binding them shut so that whatever was inside could not get out. As she peered through the lattice of sticks, she realized there wasn't an actual room on the other side of each door, but a small enclosure, some sort of prison cell. Then she saw, crammed into the hole, closed in by impenetrable woven stick walls, was a small Cherokee boy about 10 years old, staring out at her with wide, pleading eyes.